curious kind of what your experience has been coming from Silicon Valley to the charter city space, and like where have the lessons been really useful and where have the lessons required a bit of relearning on your part?
The basic thing of the Silicon Valley that works great is kind of the innovation and execution process when it comes to building stuff. But it can't always be used in exactly the same way. You can't bring that type of vibe into banking compliance. You can't bring that type of vibe into a developing world government that's trying to figure out how to accelerate its economic development strategy. The iteration cycles are longer in these other domains. Government, it's even longer than anything else, right? Because for us, we have to go through a whole legal process. I've been working on this company now for like a couple years, and we're only now about to start building real physical things on the ground. So that's what you have to do when you dive into something like this. You have to say, what can I bring from the Silicon Valley playbook of moving quickly, iterating quickly, executing well, but let me just be careful first and listen and observe what's going on in this domain, because I want to come in humbly and I want to bridge what I know how to do and how I know how to execute into the realities on the ground for this particular domain.
Hello, welcome to the Charter Cities podcast. I'm here with Bradford Cross, who is the founder and CEO of Alpha Cities, a charter city company that has had very good traction in negotiating deals with government. Welcome to the show, Bradford.
Thanks a lot, Mark. It's also to be here.
And so to start, before getting into Alpha Cities, maybe go a little bit into your background, kind of what you did before getting to charter cities and what attracted you to the charter city space.
So I've been an AI founder since the early 2000s, and I started working on AI way back in 1999 in uni. And I was a big part of this sort of first wave of doing AI and data startups in Silicon Valley. So I was a founding partner of DCVC, which was this AI and deep tech venture platform that grew into a multi-billion-dollar platform. I did the first AI startup that was in Y Combinator back in 2009. And so, over the years, I've built and exited many AI startups, and a lot of them have been in very complicated domains. Like, for example, one of my companies was the best early version of social media newsfeed ranking, and there was like sort of a war to try to buy us between Facebook and ByteDance and Twitter, and it ended up getting sold to LinkedIn and powering the LinkedIn newsfeed. I've had companies that have done AI for like AML, KYC compliance inside big banks, things that have worked on measuring clinical endpoints for clinical trials in big pharma. So I'm kind of used to these big, gnarly, complex systems, right? And trying to make the systems really efficient and performant for whatever the need it is that they're trying to serve. And then moreover, bringing those types of systems into extremely important mission critical domains that are regulated, right? Because they're very, very important, like in the banking system or in pharma, for example. And so that's the type of stuff I'm used to, and I love doing, and I like doing it. And basically, to your point of this sort of career pivot, if you will, like around 2020 or so, I had been working in and around AI for like a couple decades, and it was obvious what the trajectory is, and that's awesome. But I kind of like to be more on the pioneering side. I think AI right now, some of it is still on the pioneering side, but a lot of it is kind of an execution phase. I like it when people think it's it's kind of a little bit crazy what you're working on. And if you tell people you're working in AI right now, really anywhere in the world, nobody's going to be like, that's crazy. If you tell them you're working on the stuff that we work on in our space, right? We're trying to tackle making governments more efficient and effective for their people. People are like, okay, that's great. Like, right? Like, that's crazy. So I like that aspect of it. And I like the fact that it's big, complex systems that are hard and require a lot of very careful thought, right? Policy is very hard. It's very easy to design policy that has the opposite of the desired effect, or has some knock-on secondary and tertiary effects that end up being really negative. And so it's not like easy. It's not necessarily always obvious what to do. These are very complex systems. And so that's what I like. That's what I'm used to. And I think basically government is the largest scale, most complex system in the world that is most important and most foundational and fundamental to us. So it's like, okay, we better be innovating in this at the same pace that we're innovating in these other industries, right? Let's treat government like an industry that deserves that level of focus on innovation and attention so that it can be also building products that are way, way, way better for its customers. So that's kind of like how I look at it through my lens as like a tech founder and entrepreneur, trying to bring that over into the world of making government more efficient, right? Like I come at it as a product guy. I think of government as like it's a product. Its job is to deliver a society that has certain functionality for the citizens and it works for them in certain ways, right? And if it's not doing that, then it's a crappy product which needs to be worked on and iterated on. So that's my mindset.
Cool. And so, what I guess one of the things that I've always kind of thought a lot about is, I guess, the benefits of the Silicon Valley approach to charter cities, but also some of the challenges that don't
Right.
stand one to one.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, kind of what your experience has been coming from Silicon Valley to
Yeah.
to the charter city space, and like where have the lessons been really useful, and where have the lessons kind of required a bit of relearning on your part?
Yes, that's a great way to. So for me, there's the basic thing of the Silicon Valley that works great is kind of the innovation and execution process when it comes to building stuff. We're very good at that. And we should always try to look to use that muscle in a setting where it can be used, but it can't always be used in exactly the same way. And this is what's very important about the domain-specific adaptation of the Silicon Valley approach for whatever problem it is you're trying to solve. And again, this is where I think I've benefited a lot, actually enormously, from having worked in AI for so long and so early when I was having to convince people out in these other domains, right? Imagine convincing, like I convinced heads of compliance at some of the top 10 banks on earth to use AI in anti-money laundering in like 2015, right? And so that was a lot more difficult than getting them to do that now, right? Because nowadays there's all these tools, there's a good understanding that like, more and more people are doing this. But then it was more pioneering. And so you can't take this like Silicon Valley disruptor, like I'm going to come in as a hot shot with a big ego attitude at all, right? You're coming into a completely different domain. They don't really respect the fly-by-night approach in tech. If you talk to like a compliance officer in a big bank, right? And you're like, how buttoned up do you think they are over at Facebook or Google or whatever? Obviously, they're going to deliver some kind of a rant about how they can't take these guys seriously, right? Even though it may not necessarily be true, because like, for example, deployment of production services, management of critical infrastructure, security, protocol, everything like that. I would argue that like the big tech companies are actually more rigorous and buttoned up than anyone else on earth. Even arguably banks, having seen the inside of both. But, nevertheless, the point is they don't like the mindset and the approach of this kind of disruptive innovation, move fast and break things type vibe, right? You can't bring that type of vibe into banking compliance. You can't bring that type of vibe into clinical trials for pharma. You can't bring that type of vibe into a developing world government that's trying to figure out how to accelerate its economic development strategy and bring in more FDI, right? None of these type of environments, work for this thing, right? And you also don't have the fail fast, rapid experimentation thing where you can just stand up an app, right, and start shipping features and see how people use it and start iterating in place on top of that. The iteration cycles are longer in these other domains. And it gets like, I think government, it's even longer than anything else, right? Because for us, we have to go through a whole legal process. So I've been working on this company now for like a couple years, and we're only now about to start building real physical things on the ground because the whole first couple of years, yes, we moved very fast for what we were doing, but the work is primarily in the domain of legal and diplomacy and business development, right? And so it was hard and awkward for me in the beginning, but one of the conversations that really stuck was yeah, thank you. Is my was my partner Patri from Pronimos. He was like, just remember our philosophy of the law is code stuff, right? And so you're actually building right now, right? Don't you have this engineer mindset that if you're not building software, you're not building, or if you're not building an actual physical piece of infrastructure, you're not building, right? But we've written massive, zone laws. We have all these JV agreements. We have so much legal infrastructure. And I've worked on that a massive amount. Like I actually am like, I hate to say it, but like I'm kind of creeping up on almost an expert level, like of legal knowledge in some areas, which, historically isn't my favorite domain. But, that's what you have to do when you dive into something like this. You have to say, okay, like, what can I bring from the Silicon Valley playbook of moving quickly, iterating quickly, executing well, but let me just be careful first and listen and observe what's going on in this domain, because I want to come in humbly and I want to bridge what I know how to do and how I know how to execute into the realities on the ground for this particular domain, right? And so for this world that we're in, that means, I think, really a lot of work on the legal side, and whether it be laws or MOUs with different branches of the government or whatever that you have to do, or whether it be agreements like joint venture agreements or different entities that you're forming or whatever. Like there's a huge amount of infrastructure to build the product of a city, right? That isn't digital in the sense of software, and it isn't physical in the sense of you're building physical infrastructure or buildings. It's virtual, but it's law. It's like agreements, right? It's all these other things that are non-software and non-physical infrastructure. And I think that's a lot of the early phase of building a company like this. If you do it in this particular way, right? There's some people that are doing it in this more network statey type way, where it's more build an online community, find some type of a co-living arrangement and gradually like ratchet it up, right? For me, I think also for you guys as CCI, for Patri, for some of us who are more towards the like, let's really innovate on governance side, we're not interested in necessarily starting through that vector, because we believe that this stuff, all this legal stuff, is kind of a very fundamental foundation. Like that's what we're trying to innovate on. If we don't have the ability to innovate on that, we wouldn't make the investment, right? And that's even in our JV agreements. We have JV agreements signed with some countries where the zone law is still pending because it has to propagate through National Assembly and so on. But, if there's a time to trigger like the beginning of, let's say we have 12 months to break ground to like honor this JV contract. If they've given us some land concession, we need to break ground within 12 months. Okay, great. But the start clock for that 12 months, I'm not starting it until that zone law is passed, right? So the day you gazette the zone law, now it's 12 months from then, right? Because I'm not going to commit myself that I have to start building things now when I'm not necessarily having the piece that's most important for us to innovate on the governance side, right? So there's a lot of like complexity and nuance there that's extremely different from what you deal with in tech, right? And so I think the smartest thing I did when I came into the space to bridge myself from the tech world was I didn't try to start anything right away. I came in humbly. I spent a ton of time with you guys. I partnered up with Patri. I spent a ton of time with Balaji, lots of other people, following all the projects, talking to the founders. I spent a bunch of time with the Prosper guys, a bunch of time with the Rendeavor guys, just learning, different things about different people's models, what's working, what's not working. We ended up taking a zone law that looks a lot like all the historical work on charter cities and the ZA stuff and things like that. But then we've evolved it a little bit so that it doesn't require any constitutional change. And that's our zone law. because for various reasons we don't want to get into constitutional change. We could talk about that if you want to double click. But then, we take it from there. We get the zone law going, and unless that's going, there's nothing to really innovate on, right? Because we don't want to build a cool project that's like stuck. We don't want to have the inability to work with the government on an ongoing basis to do the innovation we need. Prosper being a great example, even if they didn't have any of these ongoing issues with the Honduran government on just purely being a Zede, right? I think one of the examples of the types of things that people overlooked with the Zedes was, let's say if I do want to have a banking charter. So these guys think they can technically just issue banking charters. That's not really true. You actually have to do this in concert with the central bank of Honduras, for example, or the central bank of any of the countries that we're working with. So you kind of need to structure it more like what DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center, does. And these guys have a certain set of paperwork in place with some of the different ministries in the central bank that enable them to do what they do. And that, I think that's a very important thing for us to all think about with these like private cities or autonomous cities or whatever you want to say, is like you can't carve it out as a state within a state and do business in important domains and have those businesses be recognized by anyone else. You have to work with the key institutions in the host state so that you can do things in a way which is, internationally recognized and valid, right? And so because of all this, it's like I've tried to just spend a huge amount of time with all these different players when I came into the space. So I really knew what I was doing before I pulled the trigger. At least to the extent I feel as an entrepreneur, you accept uncertainty. You know you're never going to be the best at everything, but you want to have at least enough expertise that you can do some damage. You don't want to come in and be like pretty helpless and learning on the fly. So, I took a few years before I pulled the trigger and started this, which I think was key from this like pivot from tech into working on startup cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like when I started the Charter Cities Institute in part because I figured a nonprofit was easier to help kind of map the space, build up relationships. Just trying to start a company. I started 8 years
Right.
ago. The company I would have started would probably be long dead by now.
Mm-hmm.
I think your emphasis on partnering with those countries is very important. It's something we've tried to emphasize at CCI is how do you make sure that it's a win-win? How do you make sure like you have the legal framework, but you also have the political legitimacy? Kind of going back to Honduras, right? Even though the legal framework's quite strong, right? It was initially passed after a constitutional crisis, a
Right.
coup, where the military put the president on a plane and shipped him to Costa Rica. Granted, the president was trying to run for a second term. That was unconstitutional, and the military turned on him as well as I think his own party turned on him, the Supreme Court. So there was kind of broad support for getting the guy out, but any situation like that is extremely messy. And then when you pass a law, especially a law as kind of impactful as the Zeta legislation afterwards, there's always going to be a question of that type of legitimacy, which is kind of the nature of politics. And so figuring out how to get kind of a really strong partnership, how to build those relationships, how to get the legal framework. I mean, an analogy I use is like in tech, it's like the I don't know, standard operating procedure to a certain extent is like you'll spend a year or two, maybe more, trying to figure out product market fit. All right. And there you'll
Mm-hmm.
basically be tinkering with like what the product is. And you do have a relatively quick feedback cycle, right? You can iterate a lot, but like a lot of tech companies take a long time before they like start growing. A few
Mm-hmm.
of them are able to know exactly what the product is immediately, but like many of them take a while figuring out what that product is. And here, I think of Charter Cities as like, I don't know, I like to think that the product is not like obvious, but a little bit easier to understand than tech, where with a lot of new tech product, you don't know exactly what it is. But with Charter Cities, it's like, okay, look, what you need to do is offer jobs and offer housing at a price point that is affordable to your target population. And if you can do those things, people would move there and live there. There's a lot more that goes into it, obviously, but like those are kind of the key elements. Um, So anyway, I guess to focus this on a question, like, how do you think about these government partnerships, right? How do you think about? You said you kind of evolved beyond the, let's call it, Honduras framework to be more of a partnership.
Mm.
Like specifically, like I guess, what does this look like? Like, what are key clauses that give you enough authority but give government enough kind of buy-in that you can attract investment, get started, but still get all the planning permissions? Like what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think abstractly, the biggest thing that we've really locked in now that seems to be working and palatable to everyone is this idea that we're like an administrative and execution partner, um, not necessarily like a legislative partner. Even though we may do rulemaking, we may not call it lawmaking, but we may do rulemaking that could be effectively the same as lawmaking within our zone, right? But we don't call it as such. We don't talk about having independent courts, but we do have arbitration, right? We do host private arbitration. And um, like we don't, like, for example, visas and even citizenship, because our first country, they've been doing a big push lately on citizenship by investment. And our second country also is interested in this. So we're going to be partnering with both of them so that we can basically move international expats with the skills that we want to the city. And that can be part of the package that we're offering them, is they can get that second passport in 6 weeks upon landing in the country. That's pretty cool, right? So there's some really interesting stuff like this that you can do. Now, again, could we get this country to just give us the ability to just issue their passports to people? No. Could we just do like, the Liberal Land guys or other people like this and make up our own nonsense passport and issue it? Yeah, sure. But good luck, getting into the airport in Singapore with this thing or whatever, right? It's not going to work when you try to hold it up to the scanner. So, at the end of the day, in reality, in practice, you need these things, which the sovereign partner can do. And if you set it up correctly, so that they're kind of, they're deferring to you the ability to administer and execute certain things, but they're not deferring their authority to you, if that makes sense, then it's actually better than trying to have like radical autonomy. Because in that sense, then you're not really set up for the practical ways that you have to work with these institutions anyways, right? Because again, I can put in my zone law, hey, I can issue banking charters, and they can pass that through the National Assembly. And it says, okay, I can issue banking charters. But that very well may actually conflict with other law that they have on the books, or it may conflict with internationally recognized expectations on the central bank. And so there's many different vectors that can be misaligned with that. In the end of the day, what matters is what agreement I can strike with the central bank. Because if I'm going to want to issue a banking charter to a neobank or a crypto bank, it isn't going to be internationally recognized, nor also will the people come. Like the banks won't come, right? Because let's say I'm saying, okay, come to one of these two small West African island countries. We're going to open a new international financial center here with an offshore banking hub. And I try to sell a real bank, right? Like a real top 5 bank or a digital bank, or I try to sell a real top 5 crypto exchange to come to a crypto bank. They're going to send somebody there if they take it seriously. And they're going to need to meet with people in the central bank and in the government. They're not just only going to meet with Bradford and be like, yeah, this is cool, we're signed on for this. Absolutely not. So you see what I mean? Like this theoretical thing that I think charter cities was in the beginning. Like the spirit of it is very good and very interesting, and I really very much believe in it. But the practical idea of like sort of a sub-state carve-out that has total autonomy and can do all these things completely independently, it's not practical for a lot of really important industries and things, right? And so for that reason, you kind of need to be more tightly integrated in with the government. Additionally, the other thing I would say that's beneficial here is um, it's there. You don't want to have partisan deal making, right? Like you don't want it to be this as it swings between the right and the left, or populist or whatever. You all of a sudden see a big push to try to unroll some of what you've done, or not push through and finish some of what you've started, right? You're kind of stuck, like trying to push everything through during this window where your guys are there in power, right? Because you're doing partisan deal making with those particular guys. And this is super problematic. It has very long-term problematic ramifications, but then also even short-term, what we've seen, even in our very first country, is infighting within the party. So we had a president and a prime minister, same party. The prime minister actually had mentored the president and brought it into the party and brought him into politics in the first place. We don't know exactly the shenanigans or what the political issues were. President is the one who appoints the prime minister, right? And the prime minister builds his government in this model. And so president fires the prime minister. And then there was a big scramble and all these different stuff shuffling around within the government. And this was right before we were supposed to sign like the JV agreement, like the most pivotal commercial contract that we sign with governments. And so it was a huge setback for us. We're ending up getting it done now, but it was basically like a 10-month setback to get that signed. But like, yeah, these guys are all in the same party, right? And it's in the same, it's within a 2-year window that we're trying to get a deal done. And so we're not at, at election boundaries. We're not having that issue. We're not having a change in parties, right? This is just within a normal term. And so this is the reality in the world. It's messy out there, right? Or like people that have tried to get things done in the current administration in the US, the Trump administration, right? Tons of people in tech have been circulating around and trying to get all kind of things done. And some stuff's getting done, but there's also churn. Of course, because some people are going to churn in and out and they're not going to work out, and there's going to be drama with the administration, and that was your guy trying to push something through, and now you're stuck in the same way that we were, right? So the number one thing is just like do deals which are amazing for the country, like you're saying, and they just bring jobs up and down the economic ladder, right? So it's hard to argue against it. It's like jobs for poor people, doing farming, fishing, manufacturing, all kinds of stuff, FDI coming in, jobs for like high-end folks, expats that are coming in, jobs for their top graduates from the local ecosystem. So up and down the whole economic ladder, it's, quality jobs, for everyone, and increased FDI and increased GDP growth are like super hard for people to argue with. Doesn't matter your party. It doesn't matter if you have a populist agenda or not. It's like, like everyone kind of wants more GDP and better jobs. Like it's tough to argue with that, especially when you're being inclusive about who's getting the jobs and you're building up and down the stack, right? That's why in our projects, we always have, an agricultural component and things like that. We have some super high-end stuff like crypto city, AI city, EV, aerospace, like super state-of-the-art stuff we want to bring to Africa. But every single one of these big projects also has a huge like agricultural and bottom-up tie-ins that are going to create vast numbers of jobs for the folks that are less well off. And that, again, just makes it really difficult for people to push against it. So in this case, in the first country we're talking about where we had the government change, that's the piece, that last piece I just mentioned about jobs for the poor, that's the piece that made it impossible for people to ignore it and have to push the project through. there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're going to be doing there, resorts and the financial center and all this stuff, right? But these things are like, they're abstract, they're bigger ideas, they're bigger bets. You have to kind of understand different industries and what makes sense in those industries and why you could do it there. All that requires a little bit more of a mental leap, right? But like, here's a bunch of poor people in this village. We're going to make a way better village for them and a giant farm, and everyone's going to be making a solid income and have water, electricity, all this stuff. Like, you can't really argue with that. Nobody wants to say no to that, right? So that
Yeah,
was the thing that, yeah,
yeah. In my experience, what governments are responsive to is jobs, especially if the Democratic governments drop near the election cycle, because that increases
yeah,
their chances of getting reelected.
yeah,
And then it has to be, I agree, it has to be grounded in something they've experienced with before. If you try to pitch them something new and different, it's you're kind of can be perceived as a little bit of a charlatan, as somebody who's out there. Well, if you say, look, you guys already do agriculture, we'll come in and do more agriculture and do it better and employ a lot more people, right? That will resonate, I think, quite well.
exactly,
I guess to
exactly.
return to your, I guess, previous kind of point, I guess just on the nature of like the joint venture partnerships and how you structure kind of permitting, I guess
Mm,
obviously depends on the industry and the thing, but one of the, I guess, right, like advantages of, if we ignore some of the challenges of the Prospera approach, is
mm,
right, is that it is independent. Uh, and one of my worries of, okay, look, yeah, it's good to get the government more involved, but then depending on exactly how that partnership is structured, right, like you can be at their mercy. And so one example, a few weeks ago, I had on the head of the Chamber of Commerce of Freeport, Bahamas, which is kind
mm-hmm,
of one of the original charter cities,
mm-hmm,
and there, the Grand Bahama Port Authority, which is the kind of private municipal government, has the legal right to issue work visas, conditional upon not being able to find Bahamian talent. And that worked well for about 15 years. And then when the Bahamas became independent, the Bahamian government basically changed what their definition of talent was and started substantially restricting the Port Authority's ability to issue work visas. And the Port Authority, the president almost, or president, prime minister, almost cut a deal. And then, but they couldn't because the bureaucracy was kind of a little bit more antagonistic to the Port Authority, and the Port Authority had the business license owners that had legal rights, and that caused it to blow up. And so, I guess the worry is, let's say you've got this partnership with government, but you're depending on government to issue a banking charter, issue A or B or C or whatever it is, and maybe it's a new government that's a little bit more hostile to your interests.
mm.
Maybe something else happened, but right, like how do you get those kind of that confidence that can attract investment, that can get the project started, if you're depending on this government that might not be as reliable as you want it to be.
Yeah, this is a very, very, very crucial implementation detail that we're getting at here. So, um, and this comes to the architecture of the whole thing. So, when I talk about delegating administrative and execution, but not necessarily quote unquote authority, what I mean is, um, in the example of the bank thing, and I'll give some other examples so we don't stick only to this, but in the example of the bank thing, um, they're not approving anything. They're not in the loop for the administration and the execution. They have auditability, right? So in the upfront agreement, we're dictating and agreeing to how we're able to issue banking charters or license any type of financial institution, right? But we do it. We can administer it. We can execute it. And we can do it in our own sandbox environment, right? Usually they call this sandboxing in a lot of different regulatory domains. So we've started calling it that too, because it seems like governments are comfortable with that terminology. And so, within the sandbox, it's going to be, it's like DIFC. It's going to be, British common law. Everything is all English, because these countries are Portuguese speaking, right? And we're not doing Portuguese civil law. We're not doing Portuguese language, right? No big important global entities are coming to incorporate and operate businesses in one of these alternative, like, old European systems in their former colonies. Like, that isn't going to happen. You're going to have to modernize that in the same way that they did in the UAE, right? So I think you just kind of copy that model, what they did in the UAE, and you get in the agreements, your quotas and all this type of stuff, up front. You remove their ability to approve things or change things, like you're saying, or define, hey, this is how we define a Bahamian now, or like this is how we define a high value expat that you're able to just offer a visa to. It's like, no, we just have a quota system, like a permanently refreshing quota system, right? That has to be like actually revisited to change anything. But there's no say in what we're doing. They have auditability always, which is what gives the government the feeling of safety that if we go off the rails, if we're administering things poorly, if we get involved in any type of bad actors or bad activities, they can pull the plug. They have full auditability. Because we have to think of it from the government side too, right? In our charter city space, we have to remember these guys can give us the ability to do whatever we want, but at the end of the day, they still have the liability for it. Like if a missile, this is crazy, but just as an extreme example to illustrate my point, if somebody launched an ICBM from Prospera, right, in the direction of the United States and it hits Miami, Florida, right? Who's everybody going to be looking at, right? Eric from Prospera or the country of Honduras? They're going to be looking at Honduras, right? So it's like they still have that top level liability. Same if there was a bad thing that happened, like if you had some weird like gene editing startup that was doing stuff that ended up not being that robust, and a couple years later tons of people die and there's a massive drama about it. Yes, the people operating the zone are going to be in the hot seat, but like the international community is going to also be looking at the country too. Hey, why did you let these guys do this in your country, right? Like, this is terrible. So we have to think of that and be mindful of the fact that we are also representing our government partners, and they do have some kind of abstract end liability in the sense of if we do something bad, right? And so like giving them that auditability is what makes them feel safe. So for me, it's like you try to do deal making so that everybody gets their needs met, right? These guys need to feel safe. They need to have auditability, but they don't need to be in control of execution and administration of this stuff on an ongoing basis. They don't need to. And that's the thing that I want to separate out. My biggest thing with innovation and governance is I believe that execution should be fully privatized. Like, I believe that, you could have a model where some of the democratic processes and things that we do to make policy and so on are fine, maybe, right? But the execution seems to be very poorly done. So I'm like, okay, let's carve out the execution and administration as much as we can, see if we can run that really well. And we can control policy, rulemaking, everything that we need to around this container, right? And then they can audit it. That's how I try to set it up. And so far, that seems to be like palatable for people. And I think we can get everything we need done there. So it's honestly not that different than like the ZA type model. It's very, very little amount of reduced, affordances for us in exchange for, I think, a huge amount of comfort and collaboration with the government. So that's what I'm trying to do. And that is, I'm not going to lie, that's based on learning from watching the Prosper example and the whole not just Prosper, but the whole ZA thing in general, right? And trying to think about like, hey, how could this have been done differently? How could we have had some kind of consortium that was more partnered with a broader coalition of folks in the government instead of having the whole thing be wedded to this other party and then have this massive drama when you had a left-leaning populist approach. It's like, well, I mean, let's not repeat this stuff. Let's learn, you know? I think there's a ton to learn from what happened in that environment, and we can try to avoid some of those things. So that's a lot of what I'm trying to do with how we've kind of tweaked the zone law approach and how we operate, is just to like avoid some of what we've seen there, you know?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I don't know if you would. I think this is true, right? Isn't the ZA thing the only real proper attempt at the charter city model so far?
The Zeta is probably the deepest by a pretty decent margin in terms of legal authority. There's one, Sherbro, or
Chebros, yeah,
Sierra Leone recently struck a partnership with Sherbro Alliance Partners. I had Siaka on the podcast
yeah,
a few months
yeah.
ago, and that is, I think, a very comprehensive, in my opinion. I think it's better than the Honduras example, and at least in terms of legal framework.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
However, they haven't really started building yet. It's a
right.
bit later in the process because right, the Honduras law passed over 10 years ago, and this one passed 3 months ago or so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And there's a hand like depending on how strictly or loosely you want to define it, there's a handful of other examples. But in terms of like you define it relatively strictly at this point, I think it's basically Honduras and
Yeah.
Sierra now.
I think didn't the Zanzibar guys have a decent similar kind of framework?
I don't know. I mean, I've seen various kind of I've never gotten like a full understanding. I think they've got some decent autonomy, but it's also like a
Mm,
digital zone. I don't know how that. I know they have a
mm,
small piece of land, like 100 hectares, but
yeah,
never had a full understanding of how much legal authority they actually had.
gotcha.
Um, but one thing, I guess, to kind of go back a little bit to one of the earlier questions on like the I don't know, similarity and differences from Silicon Valley, kind of standard startup approach, is one of the things that I found right in Silicon Valley, the kind of rule of thumb, and obviously it differs case by case, but right, like you raise money, you'll give up about 10 to 20% of your company, you get capital all in cash, and then you use that to grow the company. And after about 2 years, you go back and say, I need another X amount of money. I'll give up 10 to 20% of the company. And right, that goes on until you are acquired or go public. But right, like it's pretty relatively strong norm, right? Like you give up 10 to 20% of the company for equity. And obviously there's a lot of variations now, but and that can be justified basically for a few reasons. One, because the like outliers are so high that they pay off all the failed attempts, right? So you can make a bunch of bets, and a handful of bets might pay them off. Two, most startup companies don't actually have assets, right? The code is worthwhile if it's generating revenue if you're selling it to people, and otherwise it's probably worthless. And so, right, if you compare it to real estate, for example, real estate is small amounts of equity with lots of debt because there is a physical asset that can be reclaimed in the event of a default. And then I guess another part of it is at least with startups, right? There's kind of a very high like search area. It's not obvious what business models are going to succeed. Maybe this has changed in the last few
Mm,
years, but
mm,
right for a while, like there were people coming up with crazy ideas, some of which worked. And at least when I started coming, right, I never really found a startup before, but I had a lot of friends in the Silicon Valley space. Some of our funders are from there. Um, and saw a lot of kind of charter city companies do early rounds of funding based on kind of the San Francisco model, but it's at least that doesn't seem like to me exactly the right model. So I was just wondering, like, has your experience been that that's been an effective model? How do you think about the capital stack more generally, right? Like, how do you put all these pieces together?
mm. Yeah, very good question. I would say it's fine in a pre-seed and seed type of a stage to fund these things in a whole host of different manners. So, you know, you could raise money for, I think it's not a space that a lot of traditional VCs know about or look at, or it wouldn't necessarily fit for them. So, but if you had those type of contacts, there are some people who've expressed interest, for example, in investing in alpha that we may let into the next financing. I'm still debating that because there's many issues with VC, right? Like it's not just whether or not it gets the space and how the funding cycles are, but it's also like the exit thing, right? I'm starting to think more now as our project is getting really real, and I have to start switching from like, race to the finish line to like think ahead a little bit and a little bit longer term. Um, I'm realizing, this is not like normal equity, right? Because you're owning a chunk of this like um almost like a baby nation or something. And so it's like it's has like almost national security risk type concerns, right? In a baby way, because it's not the full thing, but it still has those, right? So you couldn't, like, for example, you could have one of these with a whole bunch of American companies in a Western aligned African state, and then you could have a founder who's completely willing to sell all their equity to a Chinese company or a Chinese national, right? And maybe all these companies operating in the zone and the host state don't want that. But if that stuff hasn't been sorted out legally in advance, you could have a serious problem, right? Now you have to have a big complicated thing in the transaction, sort of like what we saw with TikTok recently, right? By allowing that to play out so long, where there was this asymmetric policy where the US tech companies can't go into China, and then we just allowed the Chinese companies to come and do whatever, then you created this TikTok phenomena, and oh, it's Chinese spyware, whatever else, blah, blah, blah. In my opinion, the bigger issue is like, if you're not using Google, then we're not using your stuff. Like, that should have been a tit for tat thing that the US took as a negotiation point with China many, many, many years ago, but they didn't. And so then now it kind of like blew up into this weird TikTok sale transaction, which drug out for a really long time, right? And it's pretty messy. I don't think we want to be involved in a lot of those type of transactions. And so let's think further out about these type of risks, right? Like the transferability of stock. Who can it be sold to? Does it make sense for these things to be IPO'd? There's REITs that are IPO'd, and there's a whole bunch of other kinds of real estate holding companies that are IPO'd, and there's some zone management companies that are IPO'd in different countries around the world. Okay, that's an option, but do we want, and how much of the capital stack would we want to be able to be arbitrarily publicly owned and accumulated by whomever, right, in the public markets? Or do we not even want this stuff floating in the public market at all because it's a security risk, right? We don't have, there's cities in the US that are incorporated and cities all around the world that are incorporated that don't float publicly on the exchanges, right? Because there's a whole bunch of issues with that. So I think we need to think about that and look at that in terms of who we raise capital from, what their time horizon is, what's their source of funds and long-term alignment with these type of security concerns, right? So like, I think there's a much deeper need for very long-term strategic alignment in our space than we see in VC. VC is a very transactional at this point. It's very mature. It's like kind of, you're just turning the crank, and there's a well-worn path, a well-worn model. I think it's completely different from what we're dealing with. So this is one important topic area about investing in this space. The other one, and this came from, Ivan, right? From Victoria.
Yeah, the Great Harbor Group.
Yeah. So guys like Ivan, he was the first one that mentioned this to me, but then subsequently I've heard it from many, many other people too that are like these, more seasoned land developers, that like the most important investors are the industry investors, actually, not just the pure capital investors, right? So if you're going to build, like if we want to build a crypto city on a tropical island and we want to have some hospitality with some great hotels, and we want to have a big coffee and cacao estate, and we want to have a financial center, right? Well, actually, the most important investors is like, this is a Portuguese-speaking country, so, okay, let's get a Brazilian, organic coffee farm. Let's get a Brazilian organic cacao farm family or operation to come in with us and invest in doing this estate with us, right? What about the beach? Okay, let's get the Six Senses or the Four Seasons or whoever we can get to come in and be a strategic partner and agree to invest in this, right? And then what about on the finance side? Can we get maybe Coinbase or Kraken, or maybe you get maybe Citi says, hey, we want to do a neobank branch like incubation. We'll put it over, who are 2 or 3 deals like that you can get. So you kind of get your anchor industry investors in. And a lot of those people will be interested in putting capital into, the Citi Co or the top co. In our case, we have a global top co, and then we have Citi Co's because we're doing them in different places, right? So these guys might want to invest into the Citi Co. In some cases, it may be a very strategic thing. Let's say with Four Seasons, maybe we could do a sweet deal with Four Seasons where they're interested in do any city that we view as a luxury tourism destination. They want a right of first refusal to pick out, the most choice parcel for a beach resort. Like we could be willing to give something like that to a player at that level because of how strategic it is for us to be able to showcase that brand when we're going around on a roadshow to pure financial investors. And they might want to also invest globally because, Four Seasons might say, yeah, we want to put, this one country where we're going to build 2 or 3 resorts. Like this is our biggest bet here. So we want to earmark the capital for these resorts. We're also going to earmark a little bit of capital for that country co, but we want to do this like worldwide deal with you and also put some capital in the top co. This is the type of stuff that happens with this more strategic investing and deal making and operating that you see in like big scale land development and real estate development. And it's different than what we do in tech, right? Because we don't have all these types of things. You sometimes see a little bit of it with like strategic investment from, like the Microsoft and OpenAI thing, stuff like that. You sometimes see some of it, but it's like not the vanilla normal path, right? Like the vanilla normal path for VC is just like standard VC the whole way. Maybe you have a strategic in there, but it's usually way later at the growth stage. The lot of the land development guys, they do that first. So it's like if I'm gonna go approach like some top sovereign wealth funds in the UAE and Singapore, I wouldn't go pitch them unless I have some of these other players lined up too, right? Because then the pitch becomes, here's the city, it's Four Seasons, it's Six Senses, it's these top coffee brands, it's like these couple crypto shops and banks, and those are some of the anchor partners that are investing with us. Here's how much we are looking for our bigger financial partners, right? And then you go get the big checks from like those, from the big dogs. But it's like, you're not coming to them with just a high level concept, and like it's more valuable anyways, the investment that you're getting from these strategic players, right? Because it's like, if I'm going to be doing a lot of hotels and I get a globally top tier hotel operator to put in even just $10 million into like a global top co, and how does that compete against $10 million from like any random massive financial entity that doesn't necessarily have high strategic alignment and isn't having a concrete plan to do anything in any of our cities? It's just way less strategically valuable.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, to me, that all makes sense. To me, kind of as I've gotten a little bit like as these projects have matured, as we've seen some of them and gotten a little bit more and kind of figuring out how to do the capital structuring that becomes kind of critical. And I mean,
Mm.
what kind of the way I've been thinking about it, I mentioned this kind of before we started recording, but the Charter Cities Institute, for listeners that don't know, has incubated a company called the Urban Expansion Company to basically do like large scale suburbs targeting median income Africans, not full charter city, right? Like we're
Uh-huh.
not negotiating kind of
Uh-huh.
special economic zones with governments. What we'll be negotiating is development agreements, which basically says like, okay, we could have lot sizes of this size, we can have roads of this width, just like right infrastructure or zoning, land use, because what we want to do is compete with informal settlements where a lot of median income Africans live, to figure out right like how could we provide housing options for people that currently don't have good options. They might not have be able to get land title. They might not have running water, electricity.
Right.
And how do we provide this at a price point that is affordable? We're looking at outside fast growing cities, so we don't really need to start the economy. We can just use the tailwind from the city. But kind of the other part of the structure that's relevant to the financial model is right, like we're basically estimating we need between $5 and $10 million to get cash flow positive per project, right? And we've kind of structured a lot of the business model around that, because the thinking is right, like capital markets in Africa are relatively weak. We're doing a business model that has been proven. However, right, we're kind of innovating it in a somewhat new manner, trying to lower the price point, which we think greatly increases the market potential, but is also has some execution risk. And we've tried to think pretty carefully about how we actually right structure the company and the capital in a way that is right. We can get that cash flow positive and execute. And if we're successful, maybe we get a little bit more ambitious. Maybe we've got like a little bit more cash at Topco that we can undertake longer term plans. But a lot of it is right, like I don't know. It feels like 5, 6 years ago when the space was like really starting, everyone was talking about governance, and now that the projects are actually moving, a lot of it is like, all right, now we have at least a relatively high level idea about what governance is and is important, but how do we actually do the capital structure? I mean, if you look at other projects in the space, not exactly in the space, but California Forever has been very successful with fundraising.
Mm.
But part of that is right, like proximity to San Francisco, being in the U.S., kind of built on a lot of narratives that people in that area are excited about. You've
Mm-hmm.
got Prospera, which has had some decent success in raising from high net worth individuals and some kind of tech folks.
Mm-hmm.
Ciudad Morazan, which is just right, like one entrepreneur. It's his
Yep.
kind of project, so he's underwriting the cost. And so to
Yep.
me, this is like as the industry matures and as we standardize, like how like I'm not sure there will be what like because there's never going to be like a huge industry in the terms of like a dozens of different players. But like as we get a little bit bigger, I believe that the I don't know, right, capital stack will start to close a little bit as there is kind of a proven model for right, like how you think about um what type of money comes in at what different stage of the project, and how you structure that to whether it's equity or debt, and how you structure that to give comfort to the investors that they will receive a return on their capital for the appropriate kind of risk profile of the project.
Yeah. And I think you're right that like there has been and will continue to be a smattering of different capital sources for those, let's call it like tens of millions, up to 100 million type range. And I think that's where, as you said, you see a lot of tech money, maybe some VC, maybe some of the crypto VCs have made investments in the space also. Um, just ultra high net worth billionaire type folks from around the world. There's several billionaires that have backed Rendeavor, for example, right? That were folks that they had previous relationships with. They're just random billionaire successful business guys that are interested in this kind of concept, right? So I think that stuff is how it gets off the ground. You don't get it off the ground by going to do a $500 million round with Mubadala, in the UAE, right? Like that, those big institutional deals, they take longer. They take way too long, right? And we need like this type of capital that you were talking about in the very, very early years. So this is one thing that VC is good at doing, right? VC is able to put together pretty big rounds very quickly for young companies, so long as it's needed and it's clear that that capital has a very, very good chance of, turning into growth, right? So if we have that same setup, we don't necessarily have those sources to turn to, right? So that's the challenge. That's where we're at now, is like we're past the point of only being able to bootstrap off of like the tech and billionaire type world. We need to start figuring out how the institutional side gets involved. And that's what led me into focusing more on like the industry partners and then the institutional guys that are more, the big capital allocators. But I think it's basically that. It's like, if you think of it as a 3-stage booster rocket, right? It's like this kind of nebulous pool of friendly capital, billionaires, tech people, crypto people, whatever, people that have affinity to our movement. Maybe it's crypto people that are super interested in decentralization, or Eric was very successful with the libertarian type crowd, with Prospera. Um, the guys at Rendeavor, like I said, were very successful with some people that had invested with them in the past, from the sort of UK, New Zealand type ecosystem that they had a great network in. And so people are going to raise from where their network is like strongest, right? Just like how you have for CCI and your stuff, right? You have some crypto, you got some tech capital. These are guys that they trust you, they respect you, they're bought in for this vision and direction as a concept. And I think that's where we get a lot of our early money. That's the stage one of the booster rocket, right? And then I think stage two is being able to bring in real anchor industry partners, because I don't think you can go to stage three after that. I don't think you can go from this stuff to like a middling amount of traction, to then going to get a mass, talking about like $1 billion in capital from like one of the top sovereign wealth funds on earth, right? They're not going to come until you also have some other really serious industry anchor partners coming in and investing. In your case, if it's just straight resi, it's like, okay, if you have a top tier, resi developer who's signed up to do the build, and they've earmarked capital for it. Okay, great. Now you can go fly to the UAE or Saudi or whatever, right? But I wouldn't go unless you had those guys. You know what I mean? I mean, maybe to just build some relationships, but I wouldn't try to make a firm pitch without it. So for me, that's the three stages, is like the friendly capital, and then the industry capital, and then the institutional capital. And that's kind of like how you're going to scale these up and turn them into something really huge.
Cool. And I guess, yeah, to kind of let's dive a little bit deeper into that point, right? Like, how do you see and putting together stage two, like getting these industry partners, right? Like, it's at least in my limited experience, it's kind of a very delicate dance,
Mm,
because they're all a little bit skeptical. Nobody wants to move first.
hmm
They're operating in places that might not have kind of the best history. Might be a little bit more difficult to do business in, even if you've de-risked
hmm
it with a special economic zone that requires like a bit of a sales process.
Right.
Or
hmm
like, how do you kind of, right, like they get those first tenants, get those first MOUs signed, kind of scale them up over time? Like, what does that look like?
I think you got to be super, super focused on, tangencies and adjacents, right? So like, if we're talking about these Portuguese islands that we're starting in our first countries, like we had gotten a connection from Rendeavor to the guys at CBRE London that they work with to do very, very large scale appraisal of huge parcels, because that's a big systematic problem for us now as we take on all these big parcels. How do you value these, for the purposes of assessing the balance sheet and fundraising and so on? So we started talking to these guys, and we quickly realized these guys are completely uncomfortable in all the markets that we're working in, except for the very big Anglophone African markets. They'll support us in what we're doing in Nigeria and in Kenya and in Tanzania, because we have activities in all three countries now. Outside of those, it's not for them. And so you can't even get anyone to value any land in those places. You're certainly not going to get them to come and invest and do anything more than that, right? If you're not going to go to London to start trying to find partners to come to these Portuguese-speaking islands. The only people who go there, know about it, do business there are the Portuguese. So we've had to say, okay, never mind. Let's go. Now we work with PwC in Lisbon, and they're connecting us to all kinds of other folks locally, investors, different kind of businesses, hospitality companies, some of them that already operate hotels in some of these countries, right? So I can't necessarily go straight to the Four Seasons. I can't necessarily go straight to CBRE, right? I'm going to need to go to PwC Lisbon. I'm going to need to go to the Pestana group, which is like a big hotel group in Portugal. I'm going to need to go to these more tangent and adjacent things that are already familiar with this ecosystem and then get them involved and then kind of move up from there, right? So you're kind of rolling up support, customers, partners from the folks that are most adjacent and most inclined to be interested and already have, a vested economic interest in this place and some real context about it. So that you're not coming in and trying to educate people on a foreign, crazy place that they don't know anything about, and there's nothing, you don't have anyone else signed up yet, right? I think that's the biggest thing that's like really, really important is the adjacencies. And then I think it's the same for the industries. It's like everything that I'm doing, I'm 46 now, and I've spent a lot of time to build a pretty good global network, and not just in tech, but in a bunch of different industries, and in the regulatory side in many industries. And so I'm calling in favors, right? I'm calling in as many favors as I can from all these people in these industries. So like my network is a huge asset of adjacencies, right? I'm going to try to find everybody that I can that knows me and is so we have AI City Nigeria, AI City Kenya, huge network of people that are all over this and understand it and why I should do it, and they're very supportive of it, right? And it's like this. You've got to just use what you've got, to try to pull as much momentum and resources into the things as you can. So it's like, what have you worked on? What network do you have? What kind of industry partners can you bring in just because you know these people already? And then what's adjacent to the place because of the place? People that are already there and have a vested interest in it. How do you get them involved? I think all of us are going to have a hell of a lot more luck taking that approach than just try to say, okay, I'm going to do Aerospace City, Kenya, right? They have a great place right on the equator. We've got water to the east. It's a top-tier global jurisdiction that makes tons of sense for launching microsats from and stuff. I have a whole investment plan for this. But my first step is not to try to get a meeting with Elon, right? That's a really dumb first step, right? So I want to build some momentum ground up first, right? And then if I'm going to go approach and try to actually, I would like to at some point talk to Elon about this and try to sell him on the idea of like, don't just build all the star bases only in the US, which like that I wanted to mention that before I forget about this question that you've asked, because this is the biggest single issue that I'm running across right now, is that since the Trump administration started, there's been a huge meme in the US, and it was even before the Trump administration, it was already starting, right? This like, what's the Andreessen guys have a name for it, like American dynamism, right? And like there's been this big push. And so I think it's awesome. I'm my 16 of my ancestors came on the Mayflower. So I'm like, blue-blooded American going back 13 generations. So I love to see it, but I would rather see a more balanced and global mindset. A lot of people that I see, top people in tech, I don't want to name specific names, but have been very like off-putting about our project and like investing in Africa and investing internationally. And it's very much there's a lot of attitude right now about this meme of like doing all this stuff in the US and only in the US. And I think it's short-sighted, right? And I also point out to them that like, the US version of Belt and Road, what we should have had capitalism as our diplomacy going back post-World War II. The biggest mistake that the United States made post-World War II was failing to focus on a very aggressive rollout of capitalism worldwide and investing in all these countries around the world, and then leaving all these military bases all over the place, right? So we left ourselves over-militarized with these bases that we had to maintain all over the world, because we kind of had to save the day in World War II. And then it just kind of turned into this mutant, like, excessively militarized state with these global tendrils all over the place. And we should have been sticking capitalism into all these places, right? We should have been sending our companies, we should have been sending our bankers and our funds, and we should have been investing, building companies, and having everybody around the world love us because we're the country that taught them how to do capitalism and made them rich. That could have been the story of the U.S. post-World War II, but instead, we didn't really do that. We got caught up in a bunch of our own left-right politics at home. We stayed too active militarily, and we kind of missed the boat on that, and we didn't do it, right? And so I think Latin America and Africa in particular have suffered enormously because of us not really taking a savvy approach with that. Instead, it was just this aid and IMF and all this garbage. This stuff doesn't work, right? So we trended towards the wrong type of globalism. Globalism of these weird international bureaucratic organizations instead of globalism by simple capitalism, right? And investing in places and starting businesses in places. And that was our big mistake. And so then the Chinese came along and did Belt and Road, right? So when I talk to my friends now that are, leaning really heavily on this nationalist stance, right? It's like, well, this should be our alternative to Belt and Road, right? This whole charter city paradigm, or like investing in these things around the world like this should be our way of exporting the classical American entrepreneurial capitalism model around the world, which everybody wants, by the way. Like, everybody wants that model, like, uniformly. If you just come in as a partner who simply wants to engage in modern business and bring capitalism and investment, everybody wants that in the developing world, right? And so it's sad to see that with trying to focus on fixing our own problems at home, which we do need to fix, that a lot of really smart people are putting blinders on, like, from a global standpoint. And I think that that's a mistake. I think it's not befitting the reality that we live in 2025.
Yep, that makes sense. I guess before we close up, are there any questions that I did not ask you that I should have asked you that you want to answer now?
I think one thing that I think about a lot lately, which is really just something for all of us in the space as founders to keep in mind, and I know you've gone through these type of phases as well, is that, this can be extremely, extremely overwhelming compared to other businesses that you might build, right? And this is coming from a guy who, I was building AI companies when we would have ghetto, rigs in our own office that we were training stuff, like real this old school. Like, it wasn't like it is now. It was actually pretty hard to get something off the ground like that at the time. It's not like now. You had the pre-cloud era, you had the early Amazon cloud era, like, stuff was janky back then. Nowadays, it's much, much easier to get stuff up and running. So there was real complexity. But even compared to that stuff, or even things that I've seen in biotech or energy that are, like, very hard, I've seen quantum computing companies, like, really hard stuff. Honestly, this is the most complex thing I've ever seen in terms of operationally. There's so much going on at the same time that kind of has to go on at the same time. And it's very hard to sequence all of it and think about all the dynamics of the capital raising and the building and the legal stuff and the team building and all the different functions and, marketing and community building, because you need to attract people internationally. You also have a community and marketing function locally within the country to attract people to come move there within. There's just such a massive surface area of stuff. It can be incredibly overwhelming. Many weeks, including these past couple weeks, I kind of have to, like, take a step back and brain dump everything and, like, reprioritize and reorganize so that I kind of get myself out of a mode of, like, cognitively spinning. You can very easily cognitively spin because there's so many different things to do. Or you can rat hole on something that's really urgent, and you're letting 5 other things that actually really need to move, you're letting them drag, right? And so I think like the biggest challenge in the early part of these things is once you unlock some real opportunity like we have, it creates a massive amount of work and a massive amount of surface area, and being able to capitalize for that and staff up for that is very important. I almost wish there was some people who had recommended to me maybe you should do a little bit smaller, like intermediate round, to just get a lot more talent around yourself to build up for that stage where we're really going to start physically building. Um, I didn't do that because I was mostly really concerned about the delays on the government side, like the kind of thing that we did see this year. I wanted to have minimum burn, minimum senior people around with high salaries, minimum capital inertia, while I still had all this risk of the super high uncertainty government shenanigans right before we have a deal in place. Once we have a deal in place, then we have more appetite for that. So I intentionally didn't do that, but it has been painful. I'm not gonna lie. In the back half of this year, it's gotten very painful because like I'm struggling to grow the team quickly enough for the surface area that we have to attack. And then I'm all the time back and forth between all the work I have to do to set up and get ready for fundraising, finish the last bit of country BD that locks the deals that we need in the data room for fundraising, and then meanwhile trying to hire as quick as I can and delegate things off to these other people. So there's a certain phase of this that's just really hard because it's not like a incremental steady growth of like a software product or something like in tech, right? It's really like you kind of get an opportunity unlocked and now you have to execute against it. And as soon as you have to execute against it, the surface area of all the different business functions is pretty big. And it actually has to be decently well capitalized. And it needs some senior people, in fact, to do a good job with some of these functions.
Yeah.
So it's hard. It's almost like the 0 to 1. It's a 0 to 1 thing where it's like it just hits, it's like a step function. And then now you have to completely mature from like this, fledgling ragtag operation with a few people and $1 million that you're just trying to get something to work to like a serious entity, right? Like you've had, it's crazy. Like the deals that we have signed with sovereign nation states as a tiny company with a tiny amount of capital, it's crazy, right? And now you have this deal, you need to deliver it. You're on the hook, right? So now you need the capital and the staff to deliver against it. And this is this massive step function change that we're going through right now, right? So like, I kind of had a sense that this might happen, but it's way worse than I anticipated. So I just want to call that out. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had the same experience. It's uh at least with like right Silicon Valley, if you're doing a kind of traditional startup, it's a little bit more iterative. So you're not
Mm-hmm.
staffing up with like 5 senior executives at the same time,
Right.
but that might be structured over like a 5-year period where you've got a little bit more kind of learning. And then B, I guess, or B and B prime or B and C, right? Like in Silicon Valley, one, you'll have friends who are like, right, if you're a Series A, you've got a buddy who's a Series B, so you can call them up and figure out, like,
Exactly.
all right, they ran through the same problem. It was a year ago. They'll be able to kind of coach you how to deal with it. And then C, there's also a bunch of executives or other talent in the ecosystem versus here, it doesn't exist. You have to map it all and find it for yourself. And anybody who's trying to give you advice, the advice is out of date or not specific or whatever it is, which is it makes it a lot more lonely and a lot more
Yeah.
difficult to figure out the first time. And I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of just like you've got a project and now you've got a massive surface area and you don't know exactly how to do it and you need to bring all these pieces together at the same time. The
Mm.
sequencing is extremely difficult because
Yeah.
you've got all of these kind of time commitments that you have to follow through on with capital sources that are kind of not used to these types of projects that you have to kind of acclimate to these types of projects and get up. And when you're talking about, right, like team tenants, government, capital, right, like you're just juggling all these balls in a way that basically hasn't really been done before. That makes it quite challenging. So I'm
Yeah. And
definitely
you
with.
have to build it differently because the key, this is, I should have actually said this earlier because I want to tie this back to your first question about the delta between the Silicon Valley and this space, right? Is that like let me think of how to put this. You can be pretty poor in a lot of areas in a startup as long as you're very good at like the one or two areas that really matter, right? And so you can have that means you can have junior people in there or nobody at all. You see what I'm saying? Like there's whole business functions that you may not even need to build until like Series C, Series D, or at least Series B, so you're putting a lot of stuff off and you're focusing on your special sauce. And that's going to be special sauce that's around typically, 1, 2, 3 core functions. You're not having to become world-class in all these functions at the same time so quickly. But in our space, you kind of do. You can't leave some of these things to be crappy with a junior person, right? Like authoring my joint venture agreement with a sovereign nation state or communicating my message on social media when I have investors and government officials looking at my account, right? That's not the same thing as a junior person that I can have communicate a message on my social media account for some small SaaS startup that nobody important is really paying attention to, right? So even that way of launching it, like we're launching a brand with an IG account that has like 1,000 followers, but some of those followers are prime ministers already, right? So it's like that's not like a normal tech startup. And so I can't have a junior person who does a mediocre job and puts out a message on one of our social media channels that sounds kind of funky, right? So there's each of these business functions need a certain level of performance and polish and seniority that just has to happen across too many areas at the same time to build it the same way as you build a tech startup. So that was a wake-up call for me because I tried to go too far, too long, trying some of that hacky kind of approach without realizing no, wait a minute, this whole area needs to perform in a different league and be more professionalized already. Like, how do I leap to that now? Because I can't just have one or two junior people muddling along doing a mediocre job here. So that's just very different. I don't think I've never seen a tech startup that has to get good at so many things so quickly just to build their main product that we do in our space. It's a different league entirely as far as this goes.
Yeah, well, welcome to the party.
Yeah.
All right.
It doesn't feel very much like a party, unfortunately.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the podcast, and it sounds like you made a lot of progress. So, kind of good luck on continuing with that progress.
I look forward to us hosting each other in some of our island cities within the next year here.
Great.
So, all right. Okay. Cheers, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the Charter City podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd appreciate you sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.